Narrator. For years, the public was told that video footage from the Metropolitan Correctional Center clearly proved no one entered Jeffrey Epstein's cell on the night of his death. Officials insisted the cameras were functioning, the tier was secure, and the timeline was airtight. Any gaps, they said, were minor technical glitches, routine issues in an aging federal facility. The case was closed. The conclusion was simple: suicide. But in July 2025, when the FBI finally released the so-called raw files under the Transparency Act, independent forensic analysts began combing through the data frame by frame. What they found wasn't dramatic at first. No shadowy figure, no obvious intruder. Instead, it was something subtler. Embedded timestamps appeared inconsistent. Segments of footage overlapped by fractions of a second. Metadata showed encoding markers suggesting the files had been processed more than once before release. The government had long maintained that the cameras outside Epstein's cell had malfunctioned. Yet, the newly released files seemed to tell a more complicated story. There were logs indicating active recording during the very window previously described as lost. Audio channels, previously thought to be non-existent, contained faint ambient noise. Experts couldn't make out voices, but they could confirm the microphones were not entirely dead. Even more puzzling were the system access records. According to the facility's internal digital logs, the surveillance server had been remotely accessed shortly after midnight, not unusual on its own, but never disclosed in prior reports. Officials later stated that routine diagnostics were often performed automatically. Critics questioned why those diagnostics coincided so precisely with the timeframe under scrutiny. Former federal technicians interviewed about the anomalies offered cautious explanations. Compression artifacts, they said, can mimic edits. Automatic time resynchronization can create timestamp drift. None of the irregularities conclusively proved tampering. But collectively, they challenged the long-standing claim that the footage was clear and complete. Public reaction reignited almost overnight. Lawmakers called for renewed hearings. Civil liberties groups demanded independent review of the original hardware. Commentators across the political spectrum asked the same question. If nothing was hidden, why hadn't these technical details been disclosed from the beginning? The Department of Justice responded with a brief statement. The files were authentic, the investigation's conclusions unchanged. Any inconsistencies, they said, were the result of outdated equipment and routine digital processing. The footage once presented definitive proof, now felt less like an answer and more like another layer in a case already surrounded by doubt. Narrator. Sometimes the most consequential revelations aren't found in what a video shows, but in what it quietly fails to explain.
Forensic expert. Look closely at the timestamp 10:40 p.m. Slow it down to quarter speed. Right there, you see that movement. Investigators labeled it an orange blob. In the official Department of Justice report, it's described as a correctional officer carrying folded inmate linens down the tier. Harmless, routine. But when we isolate the frame and enhance the contrast, the shape becomes more defined. Notice the articulation here. That's not a loose bundle shifting randomly. The mass pivots at what appears to be a shoulder point. There's a narrowing consistent with the torso, and watch the lower portion. There's a stagger in the motion, almost like a gait adjustment. Fabric doesn't hesitate before turning a corner. Fabric doesn't redistribute weight mid-step. Now zoom in further. See the color saturation. The orange isn't diffused the way cloth would appear under fluorescent lighting. It holds density. It absorbs light the way a jumpsuit does when stretched over form. And the movement speed 1.3 meters per second aligns with a walking human, not someone carefully balancing a stack of laundry. The government's explanation assumes perspective distortion. that the camera angle flattens depth and exaggerates motion, but we map the corridor dimensions. If this were linens carried at chest height, the silhouette would sit higher in frame. Instead, the center of mass is lower, roughly waist level for someone walking upright. Narrator: the footage shows this orange shadow turning toward the corridor that leads directly to Epstein's cell block. After that, the camera view becomes partially obstructed by the stairwell wall. There is no corresponding return movement in the next visible frames. If the figure was a correctional officer, why is there no second officer visible, as protocol requires? If it was laundry, why is there no cart? And if it was neither, then who or what was captured moving toward one of the most closely watched inmates in federal custody? Independent analysts agree that enhancement can introduce interpretive bias. Still, the unanswered questions linger. The orange shadow represents the last recorded movement toward Epstein's tier before he was discovered unresponsive the following morning. Was it simply an overanalyzed blur in aging surveillance footage? Or was it a presence never meant to be noticed? Forensic expert: when you deal with low-resolution prison cameras, you rarely get clarity. What you look for instead is consistency, and this, whatever it is, behaves consistently with a person. Narrator: in a case defined by missing minutes, malfunctioning cameras, and procedural failures, a single ambiguous silhouette has become the center of renewed scrutiny, because if that shadow was an inmate or anyone not accounted for, it raises a question far more troubling than a technical glitch. How did someone access the most secure wing of the facility without leaving a trace?
Narrator: then, there is what investigators have come to call the missing minute. At 11 hours 59 minutes and 0 seconds p.m. The corridor camera displays a normal feed. The tier is quiet, fluorescent lights humming overhead. At 11 hours 59 minutes and 59 seconds, the image freezes for a fraction of a second. And then, instead of rolling over naturally to 12 hours 0 minutes and 0 seconds a.m., the screen goes black. Exactly 60 seconds later, the footage resumes. Officials have described this interruption as a nightly system reset, a routine automated process in older digital recording systems designed to archive files and refresh memory buffers. They emphasize that such resets were documented, standardized, and unrelated to any particular inmate. But critics argue the timing is difficult to ignore. Midnight marks the precise boundary between the day Epstein was alive and the morning he was found dead. Investigative journalist: the problem with the reset explanation isn't just the missing 60 seconds. It's what happens after the video comes back. When playback resumes at 12 a.m., the aspect ratio subtly changes. The image appears fractionally narrower. The field of view shifts by a few pixels to the right. You can line up fixed objects, the railing here, the door frame there, and they no longer align perfectly with the pre-cut frames. That doesn't typically happen during an automated server reset. Forensic analysts who examined the metadata reported another anomaly. Encoding signatures consistent with Adobe Premiere Pro, not the kind of signature you'd expect from a prison's closed-circuit security system, which typically exports footage in proprietary formats or standard surveillance codecs. Narrator: the Department of Justice has responded that the editing software was used solely to compile and convert footage into a playable format for disclosure. They maintain that no visual content was altered, only transcoded for compatibility. But the anomalies do not end there. Investigative journalist: if you're producing evidence for transparency, why record your screen? Narrator: officials have characterized the cursor as an artifact of the duplication process, arguing that technical staff documented the footage in real time during internal review. They insist the content itself remains intact. Individually, each detail might have a mundane explanation, a routine reset, a formatting conversion, a documentation oversight, Collectively, they raise a more complicated question. If the footage was complete and unaltered, why does it bear the fingerprints of post-production in a case already defined by malfunctioning cameras, sleeping guards, and broken protocols? The missing minute has become less about what happened during those 60 seconds, and more about why the public has never seen a truly original, verifiable version of the record. Because sometimes, doubt doesn't begin with what's missing. It begins with how the evidence is presented. Narrator. The FBI stated in its summary that surveillance cameras covered every entrance to the special housing unit. On paper, the system appeared comprehensive, overlapping angles, fixed corridor views, and a primary camera trained on the tier where Epstein was housed. But when independent analysts recreated the camera placements using architectural diagrams of the Metropolitan Correctional Center, a different picture emerged. Our reconstruction shows that the staircase leading directly to Epstein's cell tier was positioned at the edge of the primary camera's field of view. The lens captured the lower landing, but not the full ascent. Once someone moved beyond a certain point on the stairs, they slipped into a wedge-shaped blind spot created by the wall and the camera's mounting angle. In practical terms, that means an individual could have approached from below, climbed most of the staircase, and reached the tier without ever appearing clearly on the main shoe camera. Only a partial silhouette, or nothing at all, would register. Security experts note that blind spots are not unusual in older facilities. Cameras are often installed for general deterrence, not forensic perfection. But in a unit housing one of the most high-profile federal inmates in the country, critics argue the margin for uncertainty should have been far smaller. Narrator. According to official reports, 2 correctional officers were assigned to monitor the unit that night. Later, investigations revealed lapses in required rounds and falsified log entries. The cameras, once described as definitive proof of isolation, now appear less absolute. If the staircase was indeed partially obscured, it complicates the original claim that no one could have entered undetected. It doesn't prove someone did, but it challenges the certainty that no one could. Closing. As investigations continue into 2026, with renewed congressional inquiries, independent technical reviews, and public scrutiny of the surveillance chain of custody, the central question has shifted. It is no longer only about what happened inside a single cell,